The military station buzzed with its usual morning activity as soldiers moved through the gates with their duffel bags and equipment. Sergeant Marcus Thompson stood at his checkpoint, scanning each person who passed through with the same careful attention he had given to this duty for the past 3 years. The September sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting long shadows across the concrete grounds. Marcus adjusted his cap and prepared for another routine day of security checks. At precisely 0700 hours, a young private approached the checkpoint. The soldier looked no older than 22, with nervous eyes that darted around the station. His uniform was crisp and properly worn, but something about his posture caught Marcus's attention. The private carried a standard-issue backpack that seemed unusually bulky, and he held it against his chest rather than wearing it on his back like most soldiers did. Marcus raised his hand in the standard gesture, signaling the private to stop for inspection. The young man froze mid-step, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the backpack straps tighter. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Marcus had seen many nervous soldiers pass through his checkpoint, especially the new recruits, but this felt different. The private's breathing was shallow and quick, and his eyes kept dropping to the bag he clutched so protectively. The checkpoint area was simple and functional, with metal detectors on one side and a table for bag inspections on the other. Other soldiers passed through without incident, some nodding at Marcus as they headed to their assignments. But the young private remained rooted to his spot, as if his boots had been nailed to the ground. Marcus stepped forward and asked the soldier to place his backpack on the inspection table. His voice was firm but not unkind, the tone of someone who had done this thousands of times before. The private hesitated for a long moment before slowly moving toward the table. His hands trembled as he began to lower the backpack, and then something unexpected happened. A small muffled sound came from inside the bag. It was soft and brief, but unmistakable to Marcus's trained ears. The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he looked at the private, whose face had gone pale. Another sound emerged, slightly louder this time, a tiny whimper that made several nearby soldiers turn their heads. Marcus reached for the zipper of the backpack, but the private suddenly spoke up, his voice cracking with emotion. He explained that he couldn't leave it behind, that nobody else would take care of it, that it would die if he didn't do something. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush, making little sense to anyone listening. Marcus paused and looked at the young soldier's face, seeing genuine anguish written across his features. Whatever was in that bag clearly meant everything to this kid. With careful hands, Marcus unzipped the backpack himself. The other soldiers at the checkpoint gathered around, curious about what could cause such a commotion. As the zipper opened fully, a small furry head popped out, followed by 2 enormous brown eyes that blinked in the sudden light. It was a German Shepherd puppy, no more than 8 weeks old, with oversized paws and ears that seemed too big for its tiny head. The pup looked around with innocent curiosity, completely unaware of the trouble it had caused. The checkpoint fell silent as everyone stared at the unexpected discovery. The puppy's tail began to wag slowly, and it let out a small yawn that revealed tiny white teeth. Its fur was a mix of black and tan, classic German Shepherd coloring, but it was matted and dirty. The pup looked thin, its ribs slightly visible beneath the fur, suggesting it hadn't been eating properly. Despite its rough condition, the puppy radiated a kind of helpless charm that immediately touched something in every person watching. Marcus lifted the puppy out of the backpack, holding it carefully in his large hands. The animal was surprisingly light, barely weighing a few pounds. It squirmed a bit but didn't seem frightened, instead trying to lick Marcus's fingers with a pink tongue. The sergeant looked from the puppy to the private, waiting for an explanation. The young soldier's eyes were now filled with tears, and he struggled to find the right words to explain his actions. The private began to tell his story in a halting voice. 3 weeks ago, he had been on patrol in a rural area near the base when he heard crying coming from an abandoned building. Inside, he found this puppy and 2 siblings all alone and starving. There was no mother dog anywhere, no food, no water. The building was scheduled for demolition the next day. He tried to find someone to take all 3 puppies, contacted local shelters and rescue groups, but everyone said they were full. They told him the puppies would likely be euthanized if brought in. He managed to find homes for 2 of the puppies with civilian families who lived near the base, but nobody would take the 3rd one. This little German Shepherd was the last one left. The private had been caring for it secretly in his barracks for weeks, sneaking it food from the mess hall and keeping it hidden in his locker during inspections. But today, he received orders for immediate deployment overseas. He would be leaving within hours, and he panicked. He couldn't leave the puppy behind with nowhere to go. The young soldier's plan had been desperate and poorly thought out. He intended to smuggle the puppy through the checkpoint, then find someone on the other side who might help. He knew it was against regulations, knew he could face serious disciplinary action, but he felt he had no other choice. As he spoke, tears rolled down his cheeks openly. He looked at Marcus with pleading eyes and said he couldn't let another living thing die. Not after everything he had already seen in his service. Marcus stood there holding the puppy, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. Military regulations were clear about unauthorized animals on base, and what this private had done was a serious violation. Yet as he looked at the trembling young soldier and the innocent puppy in his hands, he found himself in an impossible position. The other soldiers at the checkpoint watched in silence, waiting to see what their sergeant would do. Some of them looked sympathetic, while others maintained neutral expressions, unwilling to show where their loyalties lay in this unexpected dilemma. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as Marcus stood at the checkpoint, still cradling the German Shepherd puppy. His mind raced through the possible courses of action, each one carrying its own set of consequences. He could report this directly to his commanding officer, which would likely result in disciplinary action for the private and an uncertain fate for the puppy. He could confiscate the animal and have it removed from the base, sending it to whatever shelter had room. Knowing full well what that might mean for such a young dog, the private stood before him with his shoulders slumped in defeat, clearly expecting the worst. Other soldiers had stopped their morning routines to watch the scene unfold, forming a small crowd around the checkpoint. Some whispered to each other, speculating about what would happen next. A few pulled out their phones, wanting to capture this unusual moment, but Marcus shot them a look that made them quickly put the devices away. This wasn't entertainment, this was a young soldier's future hanging in the balance, along with the life of an innocent animal. Marcus called over his corporal, a woman named Sarah Chen who had worked with him for over a year. She approached and immediately noticed the puppy, her stern expression softening slightly at the sight of the small creature. Marcus explained the situation in low tones while the private waited anxiously several feet away. Sarah listened carefully, occasionally glancing at the young soldier and the puppy. When Marcus finished speaking, she crossed her arms and let out a long breath, clearly understanding the complexity of the problem they faced. The regulations were straightforward on paper, but real life was never that simple. Sarah mentioned that her cousin ran an animal rescue organization about 40 miles from the base, but they were completely full and had a waiting list of over 50 animals. She had volunteered there last month and seen the overcrowded conditions firsthand. Every kennel was occupied and they were struggling with funding and volunteers. Taking in another puppy, especially one so young that required constant care, would be nearly impossible for them right now. Marcus looked down at the German Shepherd pup, which had fallen asleep in his arms, exhausted from its stressful morning. The tiny body rose and fell with each breath, completely trusting and vulnerable. He thought about his own children back home, about the values he tried to teach them regarding responsibility and compassion. He thought about what it meant to be a soldier, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. This situation was testing more than just his adherence to military protocol. He made a decision that surprised even himself. Marcus handed the puppy to Sarah and asked her to take it to the break room temporarily, away from the checkpoint area. Then he turned to the private and told him to follow to his office. The young soldier's face went even paler, convinced he was about to receive formal charges. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse, sensing that the immediate drama had passed, though many continued to glance back with curious expressions. Inside the small office attached to the checkpoint building, Marcus gestured for the private to sit down. The room was sparse and functional, with a metal desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets lining one wall. Certificates and commendations hung in simple frames, evidence of Marcus's long and distinguished service. He sat behind his desk and studied the young soldier across from him, seeing past the uniform to the scared kid underneath who had been trying to do what he thought was right. Marcus asked the private his name and how long he had been in service. The young man identified himself as Private First Class Daniel Rivera, enlisted for just under 2 years. This was his first deployment and he was terrified, though he tried not to show it. Daniel had grown up in a small town in Texas, the youngest of 4 siblings, and had joined the military to help pay for college. He wanted to become a veterinarian, which explained his attachment to the puppy. Animals had always been his passion, his escape from a difficult childhood. As Daniel talked, Marcus learned more about the puppy's story. The abandoned building where Daniel found the litter had once been a farmhouse, left empty after the elderly owner passed away with no family to claim the property. The mother dog must have been a stray who found shelter there to have her puppies, but something had happened to her. Daniel searched the area extensively but never found any sign of the mother. The 3 puppies had been huddled together for warmth, barely alive when he discovered them. For the past 3 weeks, Daniel had devoted every spare moment to caring for the German Shepherd pup. He woke up early to feed it before morning formation, snuck out during lunch breaks to check on it, and stayed up late making sure it was comfortable. He had spent most of his meager paycheck on puppy food and supplies from the base exchange. Other soldiers in his unit knew about the puppy, and some had even helped hide it during inspections, moved by Daniel's dedication and the puppy's sweet nature. Marcus listened to all of this without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Daniel finished speaking, an uncomfortable silence filled the small office. The young private sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap, waiting for judgment. Outside, the normal sounds of the military base continued. Trucks rumbling past, orders being shouted, the daily rhythm of military life that never stopped for individual problems or concerns. Finally, Marcus leaned forward and asked Daniel a direct question. If the puppy survived and found a good home, would Daniel be able to focus on his deployment without worrying? Would he be able to perform his duties effectively, knowing the animal was safe? Daniel nodded emphatically, explaining that his inability to focus was entirely because he didn't know what would happen to the pup. If he knew it was truly safe and cared for, he could deploy with a clear mind and do his job properly. Marcus explained the reality of the situation with brutal honesty. The puppy was young and required extensive care, multiple feedings per day, training, veterinary checkups, and constant supervision. It couldn't stay on the military base under any circumstances. Finding someone willing to take on that level of responsibility on such short notice would be extremely difficult. Most people wanted older, trained dogs, not puppies that would chew up their furniture and require months of house training. The chances of finding a suitable home before Daniel's deployment in a few hours were slim to none. Daniel's face crumpled as the weight of these words hit him. He had known all of this intellectually, but hearing it stated so plainly made the situation feel hopeless. He apologized repeatedly for his poor judgment, for breaking regulations, for causing problems. He said he would accept whatever punishment was deemed appropriate, but begged Marcus to please not let the puppy be sent to a shelter where it might be put down. His voice broke on these last words, and he struggled to maintain his composure. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base sprawling before him. He had served in this military for 22 years, had seen combat, had lost friends, had made countless difficult decisions. But somehow this moment with a young soldier and a puppy felt just as important as any of those. He thought about the message this situation sent, about what it meant to care for the vulnerable, about the kind of men and women he wanted serving beside him in uniform. People who cared too much were sometimes better than people who didn't care at all. He turned back to Daniel with a decision made, though he hadn't fully worked out all the details yet. Marcus told the private that he wouldn't be filing any formal reports about this incident, at least not immediately. However, the puppy absolutely could not stay on base or be smuggled anywhere. They had until the end of the day to find a legitimate solution, which meant they had approximately 9 hours to accomplish what Daniel hadn't been able to do in 3 weeks. It was a long shot, but it was a chance. Daniel looked at Marcus with a mixture of disbelief and hope, unable to process that he might actually get help instead of punishment. Marcus called Sarah back into the office and explained his plan. They would spend the day making calls, reaching out to every possible resource and trying to find a home for the puppy before Daniel had to report for deployment. Sarah raised her eyebrows at this decision, but nodded in agreement. She had always respected Marcus's judgment, and if he thought this was worth their time, she would support him. The first few hours proved frustrating and discouraging. Marcus and Sarah divided up a list of animal shelters, rescue organizations, and veterinary clinics within a 50-mile radius. Each phone call followed the same pattern: initial interest, questions about the puppy's age and health, then apologetic refusals once they learned how young it was and that it needed immediate placement. Everyone was full, understaffed, or dealing with their own crises. The puppy slept peacefully in a makeshift bed Sarah had created from a cardboard box and some old towels, completely unaware of the desperate efforts being made on its behalf. Daniel sat in the corner of the office, occasionally allowed to hold and comfort the puppy while Marcus and Sarah worked the phones. The young soldier watched with growing despair as each call ended in disappointment. He had tried so hard for weeks to find a solution, and now even with help from his superiors, the outcome looked the same. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with each passing minute, marking the countdown to his deployment time. Around mid-morning, Marcus received a call back from a woman who ran a small rescue operation from her rural property. She had been thinking about their earlier conversation and wanted to know more details about the German Shepherd puppy. Marcus described the pup's condition, its sweet temperament, and the unusual circumstances of how it came to be at the military checkpoint. The woman listened carefully, asking specific questions about the puppy's health, eating habits, and behavior. She explained that she specialized in German Shepherds and had experience with very young puppies, but her facility was already at capacity. However, she mentioned something that sparked hope. There was a family on her waiting list who had been approved for adoption months ago, but were waiting for the right dog. They specifically wanted a young German Shepherd puppy to raise and train themselves. The family had experience with the breed, a large fenced yard, and both parents worked from home, so they could provide the constant care a puppy needed. The only reason they hadn't been matched yet was because young German Shepherd puppies rarely came through her rescue. Most were older dogs or mixed breeds. Marcus felt a surge of cautious optimism as the woman continued talking. She said she would need to contact the family immediately to see if they were still interested and available. She would also need to arrange a veterinary check for the puppy before any adoption could be finalized, as it was her policy to ensure all animals were healthy before placement. She asked if they could bring the puppy to her location that afternoon, which was about 90 minutes away from the base. Marcus looked at the clock and did quick mental calculations about Daniel's deployment schedule. The timing would be incredibly tight. Daniel needed to report for his deployment briefing at 1600 hours, and it was already 11:30. If they left immediately, they could drive to the rescue facility, have the puppy examined by the woman's veterinarian, and potentially meet the adoptive family if they were available on such short notice. But this would mean Marcus leaving the base during his duty hours, taking a private with him, and using military time for personal business. It was bending rules, though not quite breaking them, and it required approval from someone higher up the chain of command. Marcus made a decision that he knew might come back to haunt him. He told the rescue operator they would be there by 1300 hours and hung up the phone. Then he called his commanding officer, Major Patricia Hoffman, and requested an immediate meeting. Sarah stayed with Daniel and the puppy, while Marcus walked across the base to the administration building. His heart pounded harder than it had during some combat situations, knowing he was about to ask for something highly unusual and potentially career-damaging. Major Hoffman was a stern woman in her mid-40s with a reputation for being fair but uncompromising when it came to regulations. She had served in multiple combat zones and ran her command with military precision. When Marcus entered her office and stood at attention, she looked up from her paperwork with a questioning expression. She gestured for him to sit and asked what was so urgent that he needed to interrupt her schedule without proper advance notice. Marcus explained the entire situation, from the moment the private appeared at his checkpoint with the bulging backpack to the current rescue opportunity that required immediate action. He spoke clearly and concisely, not trying to downplay the rule violations but focusing on the broader picture of a soldier's mental state before deployment and the life of an innocent animal. He acknowledged that his request was unusual, but argued that sometimes the right thing to do didn't fit neatly into standard operating procedures. Major Hoffman listened without expression, her fingers drumming lightly on her desk. When Marcus finished speaking, she leaned back in her chair and studied him for a long moment. She asked him directly if he thought this private, Daniel Rivera, was fit for deployment despite this incident. Marcus didn't hesitate in his response. He stated that Daniel's actions showed compassion and responsibility, even if his methods were misguided. A soldier who cared that deeply about a helpless animal would care just as deeply about his fellow soldiers in the field. The major considered this response, then asked about the practical aspects of Marcus's request. Who would cover his checkpoint duties? How would they ensure Daniel made it back in time for deployment? What would happen if the adoption fell through? Marcus had anticipated these questions and had prepared answers for each one. Sarah could manage the checkpoint with support from other personnel. He would personally guarantee Daniel's timely return, even if it meant driving at maximum safe speed. If the adoption failed, they would have to explore other options. But at least they would have exhausted every reasonable possibility. Major Hoffman stood up and walked to her window, much as Marcus had done in his office earlier that morning. She spoke without turning around, her voice carrying a weight of years of service and difficult decisions. She said that the military taught soldiers to follow orders, respect authority, and maintain discipline, but it also taught values like loyalty, honor, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes those teachings came into conflict, and good leaders had to make judgment calls about which values took precedence in any given situation. She turned back to face Marcus and gave her decision. He had 4 hours to handle this situation and return Private Rivera to the base in time for deployment processing. She would personally ensure the checkpoint was covered and would note in the records that both Marcus and Daniel were on authorized temporary duty. However, if anything went wrong, if Daniel missed his deployment or if this incident attracted negative attention from higher command, Marcus would bear full responsibility. His career would be on the line for the sake of one puppy and one young soldier's peace of mind. Marcus stood and saluted crisply, accepting these terms without hesitation. Major Hoffman returned the salute, then did something unexpected. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out her personal credit card, handing it to Marcus. She told him to use it if the puppy needed any veterinary care or supplies that Daniel couldn't afford. She said quietly that she had lost her own German Shepherd 6 months ago, a military working dog that had served alongside her for 8 years. She understood the bond between a soldier and a dog, even a puppy that had only been in someone's life for a few weeks. Marcus took the card with surprise and gratitude, seeing his commanding officer in a new light. She waved away his thanks and told him to get moving if he was going to make this work. As he left her office, Marcus felt the full weight of what he had committed to, but also a sense of rightness about the path he had chosen. He jogged back to the checkpoint area where Sarah and Daniel waited with the puppy, who was now awake and playfully chewing on the corner of the towel in its box. He informed them of the major's approval and the tight timeline they were working with. Daniel looked overwhelmed with emotion, hardly believing that his superiors were going this far to help him. Sarah handed over the puppy, which Marcus tucked carefully into a proper pet carrier they had borrowed from the base veterinary clinic. The three of them piled into Marcus's personal vehicle, a sturdy pickup truck that had seen better days but ran reliably. As they pulled out of the base gates, Daniel sat in the back seat with the carrier on his lap, whispering promises to the puppy about the good life it was going to have. The drive through the countryside gave everyone time to process the morning's events. Marcus focused on the road while Sarah navigated using her phone, and Daniel sat quietly in the back with the puppy. The landscape changed from the urban sprawl near the military base to rolling farmland dotted with old barns and grazing cattle. The puppy seemed to enjoy the car ride after initial nervousness, pressing its nose against the carrier's mesh window to watch the world pass by. Sarah broke the silence by asking Daniel more about his background and his plans after military service. The conversation helped ease the tension everyone felt about the approaching deadline. Daniel talked about his dream of opening a veterinary clinic in his hometown, specializing in large animals since his community was mostly ranchers and farmers. He had always felt more comfortable with animals than people, finding their honesty and simplicity refreshing compared to human complications. His voice grew more animated as he described his goals, and Marcus could hear the passion and determination that had driven this young man to risk everything for a puppy. They reached the rescue facility with 20 minutes to spare before the appointment time. The property was more impressive than Marcus had expected, based on the woman's modest description over the phone. A well-maintained farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by several large kennels and training areas. Everything was clean and organized, showing the care and dedication of someone who truly loved animals. Dogs of various breeds could be seen in some of the outdoor kennels, and the sound of barking rose to greet the truck as it pulled up. A woman in her 60s emerged from the farmhouse, wiping her hands on her jeans. She had silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and moved with the confident stride of someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors. She introduced herself as Margaret Foster and welcomed them warmly despite the short notice. Her eyes immediately went to the pet carrier Daniel held, and her expression softened when she saw the German Shepherd puppy peering out with curious eyes. Margaret invited them into a room she used as a combination office and examination area. The space was functional but comfortable, with a large table for veterinary work, filing cabinets full of records, and walls covered with photos of dogs she had rescued and successfully placed over the years. She asked Daniel to place the carrier on the examination table and carefully removed the puppy for inspection. Her hands were gentle but professional as she checked the pup's eyes, ears, teeth, and body condition. She talked while she worked, explaining what she was looking for and what she found. The puppy was underweight and had some mild ear mites that could be easily treated, but overall was in better shape than many rescues she encountered. She praised Daniel for the care he had provided under difficult circumstances, noting that many people wouldn't have gone to such lengths for a stray puppy. Daniel blushed at the compliment, still uncomfortable with being the center of attention despite the positive outcome that seemed to be unfolding. Margaret's veterinarian arrived shortly after, a young man named Dr. James Chen, who volunteered his time to help the rescue organization. He conducted a more thorough examination, took the puppy's temperature, listened to its heart and lungs, and gave it its first round of vaccinations. He explained that the puppy appeared to be about 9 weeks old and would need several more rounds of shots over the coming months, along with eventual spaying and microchipping. The medical care would cost several $100s over the next few months, which was why finding the right adoptive family was so crucial. As if on cue, the sound of a vehicle approaching caught everyone's attention. Margaret looked out the window and smiled, announcing that the potential adoptive family had arrived. Marcus felt his stomach tighten with nervous anticipation. So much was riding on this meeting, and there was still no guarantee that everything would work out. Daniel stood frozen, holding the puppy against his chest like a protective talisman, not ready to let go just yet. The family that entered consisted of 4 people: a mother, father, teenage daughter, and younger son who looked about 10 years old. They introduced themselves as the Patterson family. Robert and Jennifer were the parents, while their children were named Emma and Michael. All of them immediately focused on the German Shepherd puppy, and their faces lit up with genuine delight. Michael especially seemed entranced, moving closer with careful steps as if approaching something precious and fragile. Margaret facilitated introductions and explained the puppy's background, though she kept the military aspects vague to protect Daniel's privacy. She simply said the puppy had been found abandoned and was in need of an immediate home due to circumstances beyond the finder's control. The Pattersons listened attentively, asking intelligent questions about the puppy's health, temperament, and needs. Robert explained that they had owned German Shepherds for over 20 years and had recently lost their elderly dog to cancer. They had been grieving and waiting for the right time to bring a new dog into their home. Jennifer added that they had done extensive research on puppy care and training and had prepared their home for a new arrival. They had a fenced yard, quality food already purchased, and had even set up a puppy-proofed area in their house for initial training. Emma, the teenage daughter, mentioned that she was planning to study animal behavior in college and saw this as an opportunity to learn about puppy development firsthand. Everyone in the family seemed genuinely committed and prepared for the responsibility. Margaret suggested they spend some time interacting with the puppy to see if it was a good match. Daniel reluctantly handed over the small German Shepherd, and the family gathered around to gently play with and observe the pup. The puppy responded wonderfully, wagging its tail and trying to lick everyone's faces. Michael sat on the floor and let the puppy climb into his lap, laughing with pure joy as it snuggled against him. The connection between the boy and the dog was immediate and obvious to everyone watching. Marcus observed the scene with mixed emotions. Relief that the puppy would have such a loving home, but also a strange sadness at seeing this chapter close. He glanced at Daniel and saw tears streaming silently down the young man's face. These weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude and release. For 3 weeks, Daniel had carried the burden of this puppy's survival entirely on his shoulders, and now he could finally set that weight down, knowing the animal would be cherished and cared for. The Pattersons quickly agreed that they wanted to adopt the puppy, pending the completion of Margaret's standard adoption paperwork and procedures. Margaret explained that she needed to conduct a home visit, which she could do the following day, and collect the adoption fee, which covered the medical expenses already incurred. Robert immediately pulled out his checkbook, writing a check not just for the standard fee, but for an additional donation to Margaret's rescue operation. He said it was the least they could do for the work she did and for saving this particular puppy. The paperwork took about 30 minutes to complete, with Margaret carefully reviewing her adoption contract and ensuring the family understood all their obligations. They would need to bring the puppy back for follow-up veterinary visits, complete all vaccinations, and stay in touch with Margaret during the first year to update her on the dog's progress. The Pattersons agreed to everything without hesitation, signing documents and asking additional questions about training resources and puppy care. Then came the moment that Marcus had been both hoping for and dreading. It was time for Daniel to say goodbye to the puppy he had saved and protected. Margaret, sensing the emotion of the moment, gave Daniel privacy by taking the Pattersons outside to show them the kennels and discuss German Shepherd training techniques. Marcus and Sarah stood back respectfully as Daniel knelt on the floor and gathered the puppy into his arms one final time. The young soldier spoke quietly to the puppy, telling it to be good for its new family, to grow big and strong, and to remember that someone had cared enough to fight for its life. The puppy licked his face, responding to the emotion in his voice even if it couldn't understand the words. Daniel hugged it close, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs, and whispered a final goodbye. Then he stood up, carefully handed the puppy to young Michael, who had returned to the room, and stepped back with military bearing despite the tears on his face. The Pattersons seemed to understand the gravity of what Daniel had done for this puppy. Jennifer approached him and spoke words of gratitude, promising that the dog would have the best possible life. Michael, holding the puppy carefully, told Daniel that he would send updates and photos if Daniel wanted, so he could see how the dog grew up. Emma added that they planned to name the puppy Riley, which meant valiant and courageous, in honor of the brave soldier who had saved it. Daniel could barely speak but managed to thank them and accept their offer of updates. Marcus noted the family's contact information and promised to pass along messages between Daniel and the Pattersons during his deployment. Margaret returned with official adoption papers completed, and the transaction was finalized. The German Shepherd puppy, now named Riley, had a legal home, a loving family, and a bright future ahead. The drive back to the military base was quiet but peaceful, a stark contrast to the tense journey earlier. Daniel stared out the window at the passing landscape, emotionally exhausted but visibly lighter somehow. The weight that had been pressing down on him for weeks had finally lifted. Marcus checked the time repeatedly, calculating that they would make it back with just enough margin for Daniel to complete his deployment processing. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at Daniel with an expression that mixed sympathy and respect. About halfway through the return journey, Daniel finally spoke up from the back seat. His voice was hoarse from emotion but steady. He thanked Marcus and Sarah for everything they had done, acknowledging that they had taken significant risks to help him and the puppy. He admitted that he had been foolish to try smuggling Riley through the checkpoint, that he should have found a better solution weeks ago, but fear and desperation had clouded his judgment. He promised that he would never put them in such a position again, and would focus entirely on his duties from this moment forward. Marcus glanced at Daniel in the rearview mirror and responded with words he had been formulating throughout the day. He explained that the military needed soldiers who cared deeply about things, who fought for the vulnerable, who refused to give up when others would have walked away. Those qualities made good soldiers into great ones. The mistake wasn't in caring too much, but in letting that care compromise judgment and protocol. Learning to balance compassion with discipline was part of growing as both a soldier and a person. Today had been a lesson for everyone involved about finding that balance. Sarah added her own perspective, mentioning that she had seen many soldiers during her years of service, and the ones who worried her most weren't those who bent rules trying to do good, but those who followed orders without question, and never seemed to feel anything at all. She told Daniel that his instinct to save a life was admirable, and with more experience he would learn how to channel that instinct through proper channels rather than around them. The fact that he felt genuine remorse for the rules he had broken showed maturity and good character. The conversation shifted to Daniel's upcoming deployment, and Marcus asked if the private felt mentally prepared now that the puppy situation was resolved. Daniel admitted he was still scared, as any soldier would be before their first deployment to a potentially dangerous area, but he no longer felt torn between two responsibilities. Knowing that Riley was safe and loved meant he could focus completely on his mission and his fellow soldiers. That clarity of purpose, he realized, was exactly what he needed to perform his duties effectively. Marcus shared some wisdom from his own deployments, talking about the importance of staying present and focused on the immediate task rather than worrying about things beyond one's control. He mentioned that having something good to think about during difficult moments could actually be helpful, that the memory of saving Riley might give Daniel strength when he needed it most. Sarah nodded in agreement, adding that soldiers often carried talismans or memories of loved ones as reminders of what they were protecting and what waited for them back home. They arrived at the base gates with 40 minutes to spare before Daniel's deployment briefing. Marcus drove directly to the processing center where soldiers gathered before overseas assignments. The parking lot was filled with military vehicles and families saying goodbye to their deployed loved ones. Some tears were visible, along with tight embraces and whispered words of love and encouragement. The scene reminded everyone of the real cost of military service, the separations and uncertainties that came with the uniform. Daniel gathered his belongings from the truck, which now consisted only of his regulation backpack, properly packed with authorized items. He stood awkwardly for a moment, clearly wanting to say something more but unsure how to express the depth of his gratitude. Marcus extended his hand for a firm handshake, the traditional military gesture of respect between soldiers. Sarah did the same, and both of them wished Daniel safe travels and a successful deployment. They told him to stay focused, trust his training, and take care of himself and his unit. Before Daniel walked away, Marcus handed him a piece of paper with the Patterson family's contact information, along with Margaret Foster's rescue organization details. He explained that the Pattersons had genuinely meant their offer to send updates about Riley, and Daniel should feel free to reach out when he had the chance. Having that connection during deployment might provide comfort during difficult times. Daniel carefully folded the paper and placed it in his breast pocket, close to his heart, then straightened to attention and delivered a crisp salute that Marcus returned with equal formality. As they watched Daniel walk toward the processing center and disappear into the building with other deploying soldiers, Sarah let out a long breath and turned to Marcus. She commented that it had been one of the strangest and most emotionally intense days she had experienced in her military career, and she had seen plenty of unusual situations over the years. Marcus agreed, feeling the exhaustion settling into his bones now that the crisis had passed. They had accomplished something good today, something that might seem small in the grand scheme of military operations, but felt enormously important on a human level. The drive back to the checkpoint was brief, and when they arrived, the other soldiers on duty looked at them with curious expressions. Clearly having heard rumors about the morning's drama, Marcus deflected their questions with practiced ease, simply stating that the situation had been handled appropriately, and there was nothing more to discuss. He checked in with Major Hoffman to report that Private Rivera had been returned on time and was processing for deployment as scheduled. The Major acknowledged his report with a simple nod, but Marcus caught a hint of satisfaction in her eyes before she returned to her paperwork. The rest of the day passed in routine fashion, with soldiers passing through the checkpoint for inspection as they always did. But Marcus found his mind wandering back to the morning's events, to the scared young soldier with a puppy in his backpack, to the desperate plan that could have ended so differently, and to the family who had welcomed Riley into their home with such obvious love. He thought about the strange chain of circumstances that had brought everyone together at exactly the right moment, almost as if fate had intervened to ensure a positive outcome. That evening, after his shift ended, Marcus drove home to his own family in the small house near the base where they had lived for the past 3 years. His wife Linda greeted him at the door with her usual kiss, and his 2 children, ages 8 and 12, were doing homework at the kitchen table. The normalcy of his home life provided a comforting contrast to the day's intensity. During dinner, Linda noticed he seemed preoccupied and asked if something had happened at work. Marcus shared the story of Daniel and Riley, leaving out some of the more sensitive details but conveying the essence of the situation and how it had been resolved. His children listened with wide eyes, immediately declaring that Daniel was a hero for saving the puppy. His wife smiled at their innocence but also looked at Marcus with understanding, recognizing the ethical dilemma he had faced and the risks he had taken to help a young soldier. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, silently communicating her support for the choices he had made. His daughter asked what would happen to Riley now, and Marcus explained about the Patterson family and how the puppy would grow up loved and well cared for. His son wanted to know if they could get a puppy too, which made everyone laugh and lightened the mood. Linda gently redirected the conversation, reminding their son about their family's frequent moves due to military assignments and how that made pet ownership complicated. But she winked at Marcus, and he knew they would revisit the conversation when circumstances were more stable. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Marcus sat on his back porch looking up at the stars. He thought about Daniel somewhere in the deployment processing system, probably sleeping in temporary barracks before the long flight overseas. He wondered if the young private was thinking about Riley, finding comfort in knowing the puppy was safe. Marcus hoped that small piece of peace would sustain Daniel through whatever challenges lay ahead in his deployment. He also thought about the bigger questions the day had raised about rules versus compassion, protocol versus humanity, and the kind of leadership he wanted to embody. It would have been easier to simply confiscate the puppy and file disciplinary charges against Daniel, following regulations to the letter. No one would have questioned that decision, and his own career would have been protected. But something in his gut had told him there was a better way, a path that honored both military discipline and human decency. Marcus received a text message around 9 that evening from Sarah. She had been contacted by Margaret Foster, who wanted to pass along that Riley had settled beautifully into the Patterson home. The puppy had eaten dinner enthusiastically, explored the house with typical puppy curiosity, and was currently sleeping peacefully in young Michael's bedroom. The family was already completely smitten and had sent photos to Margaret showing Riley curled up on a dog bed surrounded by new toys. He smiled at the news and forwarded the message to Major Hoffman, knowing she would appreciate the update given her personal contribution to the day's events. The Major responded quickly with a simple thumbs-up emoji, which was about as emotional as she ever got in text communications. Marcus felt a sense of closure knowing that every piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, that no one had been harmed by the day's irregular decisions, and that multiple lives had been positively impacted by choosing compassion over convenience. The weeks that followed returned to normal routine, with Marcus continuing his checkpoint duties and managing his small team of soldiers. But something had shifted in him, a reinforcement of values he had always held but hadn't been forced to defend so concretely before. He found himself approaching difficult situations with a slightly different perspective, always asking whether the rulebook solution was truly the best solution or just the easiest one. His reputation among the soldiers who passed through his checkpoint began to change subtly, from respected authority figure to someone who truly cared about the people under his watch. About 3 weeks into Daniel's deployment, Marcus received an email through the military system. It was from Private First Class Rivera, sent during a rare opportunity to access communications. The message was brief but heartfelt, thanking Marcus again for everything and providing a short update on deployment experiences. Daniel wrote that he was doing well, learning quickly and bonding with his unit members. He mentioned that he had been able to contact the Patterson family once and received photos of Riley, who was growing rapidly and beginning basic training. The puppy's progress gave him something positive to focus on during difficult moments. The email from Daniel became the first of many that Marcus would receive over the following months. Though military communications were limited and often delayed, Daniel managed to send brief updates every few weeks. He wrote about the challenges of deployment, the bonds forming with his unit, and the growth he was experiencing as a soldier, but he always included a paragraph about Riley, sharing news from the Patterson family and expressing amazement at how much the puppy was maturing. The German Shepherd was apparently showing remarkable intelligence and had already mastered basic obedience commands. Marcus shared these updates with Sarah and occasionally with Major Hoffman, who continued to show quiet interest in Riley's progress despite her stern professional demeanor. The story of the puppy in the backpack had become something of a legend on the base, though the details had been embellished through countless retellings. Some versions had Marcus personally delivering the puppy through enemy fire, while others claimed Riley was destined to become a military working dog. Marcus never corrected these exaggerations, understanding that soldiers needed stories of hope and goodness amid the harsh realities of military life. The Patterson family proved to be exactly the kind of adopters Margaret Foster had hoped for. They sent regular updates not just to Daniel but also to Margaret, and eventually to Marcus as well. The photos showed Riley growing from a tiny puppy into a magnificent young German Shepherd with the breed's characteristic noble bearing. Jennifer Patterson wrote detailed emails about Riley's training progress, health checkups, and the profound impact the dog was having on their entire family. Michael, in particular, had formed an unbreakable bond with Riley, and the two were inseparable. One email from Jennifer particularly moved Marcus. She explained that Michael had struggled with anxiety and social difficulties throughout his childhood, finding it hard to connect with peers at school. But since Riley's arrival, the boy had blossomed in unexpected ways. Taking care of the dog had given him responsibility and purpose. Training Riley required patience and confidence, qualities Michael had begun developing through their daily work together. The German Shepherd seemed to sense Michael's emotional needs, staying close during anxious moments and providing comfort through simple presence. The family had enrolled Riley in professional training classes, where the dog excelled and earned praise from the instructor. Emma, the teenage daughter, had begun documenting Riley's development for a school project on animal behavior and learning. Robert had built an elaborate agility course in their backyard, and Riley showed natural talent for the obstacles. The entire family had restructured their routines around the dog's needs, but none of them viewed it as a burden. Instead, Riley had become the heart of their household, bringing joy and unity in ways they hadn't anticipated. As months passed, Marcus noticed changes in himself as well. The incident with Daniel and Riley had reminded him why he had joined the military in the first place. Beyond the structure and career opportunities, he had wanted to serve something larger than himself, to protect and help others, to make a positive difference in the world. Somewhere along the way, the daily grind of regulations and procedures had overshadowed those original motivations. But that morning at the checkpoint had reignited something in him, a sense of purpose that extended beyond simply following orders. He began mentoring younger soldiers more actively, taking time to understand their personal challenges and helping them navigate the military system. His approach to checkpoint management changed subtly, maintaining security standards while treating each soldier with greater individual consideration. He started a small initiative to support soldiers dealing with deployment stress, creating informal support groups where service members could share concerns without fear of judgment. Major Hoffman noticed these changes and quietly supported his efforts, providing resources and official backing when needed. 6 months into Daniel's deployment, Marcus received an unexpected phone call at work. It was Jennifer Patterson, calling to share news she thought Marcus would want to hear immediately. Riley had been evaluated by a professional trainer who specialized in therapy and service dogs, and the assessment revealed extraordinary potential. The German Shepherd displayed unusual empathy, intelligence, and trainability that made him an ideal candidate for certification as a therapy dog. The Pattersons were considering pursuing this certification, which would allow Riley to visit hospitals, schools, and veteran centers to provide comfort to people in need. Jennifer explained that the idea had come from watching Riley interact with Michael and seeing how naturally the dog provided emotional support. They believed Riley could help others the way he had helped their son. The trainer estimated it would take another year of specialized training before Riley could be officially certified, but the dog's natural aptitude suggested he would excel in this role. Jennifer wanted Marcus's opinion and also wondered if Daniel might want to be involved in the decision. Since he had been Riley's first protector, Marcus was deeply moved by this development and immediately saw the beautiful symmetry in it. A puppy saved by a soldier's compassion was now being trained to help other soldiers and civilians dealing with trauma, anxiety, and emotional pain. He told Jennifer he thought it was a wonderful idea and would share the news with Daniel through military communication channels. He also mentioned that having a certified therapy dog would allow Riley to visit military facilities, potentially including the base where his story had begun. Jennifer loved this idea and said they would make it a priority once Riley received certification. That evening, Marcus composed a careful email to Daniel, knowing it would be read by military censors but wanting to convey the significance of this news. He explained the Patterson family's plan and the remarkable path Riley's life was taking. He wrote that the puppy Daniel had saved was now going to save others in return, creating a ripple effect of compassion and healing that extended far beyond that desperate morning at the checkpoint. He told Daniel to be proud not just of saving one life, but of setting in motion events that would touch countless lives in the future. Daniel's response came 2 weeks later, and Marcus could feel the emotion radiating through the carefully composed military email. The young private wrote that he sometimes had nightmares about what would have happened if he had abandoned Riley, if he had given up searching for a solution, if Marcus hadn't shown compassion at the checkpoint. Knowing that his decision to fight for the puppy was now creating opportunities to help others, made every difficult moment of his deployment feel more purposeful. He asked Marcus to thank the Patterson family and tell them he was honored that Riley would serve others this way. Marcus also learned through Daniel's emails that the young soldier had become known in his unit for his dedication and calmness under pressure. He had been promoted and was being considered for additional training that could advance his military career. His commanders noted his maturity and his ability to think clearly in stressful situations. Daniel credited much of his growth to the lesson he had learned that day at the checkpoint about balancing compassion with responsibility, about finding proper channels for good intentions, and about the importance of asking for help rather than trying to handle everything alone. The story continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Margaret Foster reached out to Marcus asking if she could feature Riley's story in her rescue organization's newsletter and fundraising materials. She believed the tale of an abandoned puppy saved by a soldier and transformed into a therapy dog would inspire donations and adoptions. Marcus consulted with Daniel, who gave permission as long as his full name wasn't used publicly. Margaret agreed and created a beautiful article that told Riley's story while protecting Daniel's privacy and highlighting the importance of rescue organizations and compassionate adoption families. The newsletter article generated an overwhelming response. Donations poured into Margaret's rescue operation, allowing her to expand her facilities and save more animals. Several families came forward wanting to adopt German Shepherds specifically because of Riley's story, understanding that the breed could be both loyal companions and service animals. The article was shared on social media and picked up by local news outlets, spreading the message of hope and redemption far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Margaret called Marcus to share that Riley's story had essentially saved dozens of other animals by generating the resources needed to rescue and place them. Back on the military base, Major Hoffman approached Marcus with an unusual request. The commanding general had heard about the Riley situation through various channels and wanted a full briefing on what had happened and what had resulted from it. The general was particularly interested in the positive outcomes for all parties involved and the lessons that might be applied more broadly to soldier welfare and deployment readiness. Marcus felt a moment of concern, wondering if this attention might bring negative consequences despite the good outcomes, but the major assured him the general's interest was genuine and positive. The briefing took place in the general's office, a formal space that intimidated many junior officers but where Marcus felt surprisingly comfortable. He presented the facts clearly and honestly, including his decision to bend protocols and the risks involved. He explained his reasoning about balancing regulations with human needs and his belief that sometimes the right solution required creative thinking rather than rigid adherence to rules. The general listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, his expression unreadable throughout Marcus's presentation. When Marcus finished, the general leaned back in his chair and was silent for a long moment. Then he began speaking about his own experiences in the military, about times when he had faced similar decisions between doing things by the book and doing what his conscience told him was right. He shared a story from early in his career, when he had taken a risk to help a soldier in crisis, a decision that could have ended his military trajectory, but instead had taught him invaluable lessons about leadership. He told Marcus that the military needed more leaders who understood that rules served people, not the other way around. The general's words caught Marcus by surprise and provided validation he hadn't realized he needed. The commanding officer went on to explain that he wanted to use Riley's story as part of a broader initiative focused on soldier mental health and deployment readiness. Too many service members struggled in silence with personal problems that affected their performance and well-being, afraid to seek help because they worried about appearing weak or facing disciplinary action. The general believed that creating a culture where soldiers felt safe, addressing personal crises before they became disasters, would ultimately strengthen military effectiveness. Marcus was asked to help develop guidelines for handling similar situations in the future, creating a framework that balanced military discipline with human compassion. The project would involve working with mental health professionals, chaplains, and experienced non-commissioned officers to identify best practices for supporting soldiers dealing with personal emergencies. Riley's story would be used as a teaching example, demonstrating how creative problem-solving and leadership judgment could turn a potential disaster into a positive outcome for everyone involved. Over the following months, Marcus found himself in meetings and planning sessions he never could have imagined when he started his day finding a puppy in a backpack. He worked alongside officers far above his rank, contributing his perspective as someone who interacted daily with soldiers at ground level. His insights about what motivated young service members and what barriers prevented them from seeking help proved valuable to the team developing new support protocols. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, connecting Marcus to a sense of purpose that had been missing from his routine checkpoint duties. Daniel's deployment ended after 8 months, and he returned to the base looking thinner and older, but also more confident and mature. Marcus was at the airport when the soldiers arrived home, and he watched Daniel reunite with his family who had traveled across the country to greet him. The young soldier spotted Marcus in the crowd and made his way over, embracing him in a tight hug that transcended military formality. No words were needed in that moment. Both men understood what they had been through together and how it had changed them. 2 weeks after Daniel's return, a special event was organized on the base. The Patterson family had completed Riley's therapy dog certification, and they were bringing him to visit for the first time since that dramatic morning at the checkpoint. The visit had multiple purposes: to reunite Daniel with the dog he had saved, to allow Riley to begin his therapy work with military personnel, and to close a circle that had opened nearly a year earlier. Marcus helped coordinate the event, working with the base public affairs office to manage the occasion appropriately without turning it into a media circus. The reunion took place in a quiet area of the base away from the main traffic flow. Daniel arrived early, nervous about seeing Riley again and uncertain how the dog would react to him after so much time. The Pattersons pulled up in their van, and when Jennifer opened the back door, a magnificent German Shepherd emerged. Riley had grown into a beautiful adult dog, with the breed's characteristic intelligence evident in his alert eyes and confident bearing. He wore an official therapy dog vest and moved with trained grace beside Michael, who held his leash. For a moment, Daniel and Riley simply looked at each other. Then something remarkable happened. Riley's tail began wagging with increasing speed, and the dog pulled toward Daniel with clear recognition. When Jennifer gave permission, Riley bounded forward and jumped up to place his paws on Daniel's chest, licking his face with enthusiastic affection. Daniel dropped to his knees and hugged the dog, tears streaming down his face as Riley wiggled with joy. The connection between them was undeniable, proof that animals remember those who show them kindness even after months of separation. Marcus watched this reunion with his own eyes growing misty, joined by Sarah, Major Hoffman, and a small group of others who had been part of Riley's story. The Patterson family stood back respectfully, allowing Daniel his moment with the dog. Young Michael watched with a smile, secure enough in his bond with Riley to share the dog's affection with the soldier who had saved him. Jennifer took photos quietly, wanting to document this significant moment in Riley's journey from abandoned puppy to certified therapy dog. After the initial excitement settled, everyone gathered for an informal ceremony. The general himself attended, wanting to acknowledge the positive outcome and the lessons learned. He presented Daniel with a commendation for his service during deployment and specifically mentioned the young soldier's character and compassion demonstrated in his determination to save Riley. He presented Marcus with a leadership award for his judgment in handling an unusual situation and his subsequent work on the Soldier Support Initiative. Both men stood at attention, honored and humbled by the recognition. Then the general did something unexpected. He announced that Riley would be designated as an unofficial mascot for the base's new soldier wellness program. The Patterson family had agreed to bring Riley for regular visits where he could interact with service members struggling with deployment stress, PTSD, or adjustment issues. Research had shown that therapy dogs provided significant benefits for military personnel dealing with trauma, and Riley's story made him a perfect ambassador for this important work. The program would be named in honor of Private First Class Daniel Rivera's compassion and Sergeant Marcus Thompson's leadership. The announcement generated applause from everyone present, but Daniel looked overwhelmed and protested that he didn't deserve such recognition for simply doing what any decent person would do. The general responded that most people wouldn't have done what Daniel did, wouldn't have taken such risks or shown such dedication to a helpless animal. Those qualities of character deserved recognition and needed to be encouraged in the military community. Marcus added quietly that Daniel's choice to save one life had created ripples that were now touching hundreds of others, and that was absolutely worth celebrating. Riley's first official therapy session took place that afternoon, in a room set up specifically for the purpose. Several soldiers dealing with deployment stress or combat trauma had volunteered to participate, curious about this therapy dog program and attracted by Riley's remarkable story. Michael handled Riley professionally, having been trained in the proper techniques for therapy dog work. The German Shepherd moved among the soldiers with natural grace, seeming to sense who needed attention most and adjusting his behavior accordingly. One soldier in particular caught everyone's attention. He was a combat veteran who had been struggling with severe PTSD and had resisted traditional therapy approaches. He sat apart from the others, arms crossed defensively, clearly skeptical about the whole idea of a dog helping with psychological wounds. But Riley walked directly to him and sat down, simply being present without demands or pressure. After several minutes, the veteran reached out hesitantly and touched Riley's head. The dog leaned into his hand and something in the soldier's rigid posture began to soften. Marcus watched as the veteran gradually relaxed, eventually sitting on the floor and talking quietly to Riley, while stroking the dog's fur. The man began speaking about his own experiences, about losses he had suffered and guilt he carried, things he had never been able to verbalize in formal therapy sessions. Riley listened with patient attention, providing the non-judgmental presence that allowed the soldier to finally express his pain. By the session's end, the veteran was in tears but also smiling, and he asked when Riley would visit again. It was a powerful demonstration of exactly what the general had envisioned when he created this program. The therapy dog visits became a regular occurrence, with Riley coming to the base twice a month accompanied by Michael and other family members. Each session helped more soldiers, creating success stories that validated the program and encouraged its expansion. Other therapy dogs were eventually brought in to supplement Riley's work, but the German Shepherd remained the program's heart and inspiration. Daniel attended sessions when his schedule allowed, finding his own healing and watching Riley help others the way the dog had helped him. As time passed, the story of Riley the German Shepherd spread beyond the military base. News outlets picked up the tale, drawn to the narrative of rescue, redemption, and service. Interviews were conducted, always respecting Daniel's privacy preferences while sharing the essential message of compassion and its multiplying effects. The story inspired similar programs at other military installations and even influenced civilian therapy dog initiatives. Riley became something of a celebrity in therapy dog communities, invited to conferences and featured in training materials. But for those closest to the story, Riley remained simply a dog who had been given a chance and had made the most of it. Daniel completed his military service and enrolled in veterinary school, his tuition partially funded by scholarships inspired by people who had heard his story. Marcus was promoted and given broader responsibilities for soldier welfare programs across multiple bases. Sarah continued her steady work at the checkpoint, occasionally reminding new soldiers about the importance of asking for help when they needed it. Major Hoffman retired from active duty, but stayed involved with the therapy dog program as a volunteer coordinator. The Patterson family continued to provide Riley with a loving home, proud of the work he did but valuing him primarily as a beloved family member. Michael grew into a confident teenager, crediting Riley with helping him overcome his anxiety and discover his own strength. Emma pursued her planned studies in animal behavior, with Riley serving as her first and most important case study. Robert and Jennifer watched their children flourish and their family bond deepen, all centered around the abandoned puppy they had agreed to adopt on such short notice. Years after that dramatic morning at the checkpoint, Marcus received an invitation to Riley's retirement ceremony. After 6 years of dedicated service as a therapy dog, Riley was stepping back from active duty to enjoy his senior years in peace. The ceremony was held at the base where his story began, with many of the original participants in attendance. Daniel traveled from veterinary school. The general, now retired himself, came to honor the dog who had inspired so much positive change. Margaret Foster represented the rescue community, and dozens of soldiers whose lives had been touched by Riley's therapy work gathered to pay tribute. Riley walked into the ceremony with dignified bearing, despite his graying muzzle and slightly stiff gait. He wore his therapy dog vest one final time, decorated with pins and patches representing all the facilities he had served. Michael, now a young man preparing for college, walked beside him with obvious pride and love. The ceremony included speeches about Riley's impact, statistics about the soldiers helped and programs created, and testimonials from individuals whose lives had been changed by brief moments with a compassionate dog. But the most moving moment came when Daniel approached Riley one last time in an official capacity. He knelt before the aging German Shepherd and spoke directly to him, thanking Riley for teaching so many people about resilience, hope, and the healing power of connection. He said that saving Riley had been the most important thing he had ever done, not because of the awards or recognition that followed, but because it had taught him that one act of compassion could create waves of goodness that spread farther than anyone could predict or measure. Riley seemed to understand the significance of the moment, remaining still and attentive as Daniel spoke. Then the dog leaned forward and licked Daniel's face one last time, bringing laughter and tears from everyone watching. It was a perfect ending to a remarkable chapter, though Riley's story would continue in retirement, surrounded by the family who loved him, and in the countless lives he had touched throughout his years of service. Marcus stood at the back of the ceremony, watching everything unfold with a sense of deep satisfaction and wonder. He thought back to that September morning when a nervous young soldier had approached his checkpoint with a puppy hidden in a backpack. He remembered the split-second decision to help rather than punish, to see beyond the rule violation to the human need underneath. That single choice, made in a moment of intuition and compassion, had created something far larger and more beautiful than he could have imagined. The ceremony concluded with Riley being presented with a special commendation from the military, recognizing his service to soldiers and his role in advancing military mental health programs. The German Shepherd accepted the honor with dignified calm, as if understanding that his work had mattered. Then the Patterson family led him away to their van, ready to begin the peaceful retirement he had earned through years of giving comfort to those who needed it most. As people dispersed from the ceremony, Marcus found himself standing with Daniel, both men watching Riley leave. The young veterinary student, no longer the frightened private who had made a desperate choice, turned to Marcus and said simply that he hoped when his time came, he would be remembered for creating even a fraction of the good that had come from one small act of refusing to give up on a life that others might have considered disposable. Marcus smiled and replied that Daniel had already accomplished that goal and would undoubtedly accomplish much more. The story of the soldier and the German Shepherd puppy became a lasting legend on the military base and in the wider community, told and retold with the kind of reverence people reserve for tales that restore faith in human goodness. It reminded everyone who heard it that compassion was not weakness, that breaking rules to do right sometimes required more courage than blindly following them, and that the smallest lives could have the most profound impact when given a chance to flourish. And somewhere in a comfortable home surrounded by a loving family, an aging German Shepherd named Riley slept peacefully, having earned his rest through a lifetime of service that began with one soldier's refusal to walk away.